It's an unfortunate fact, which anyone has to deal with when even talking about the concept of an automatic Mitsubishi Evo, that there are going to be a large and vocal group of people who just don't like the idea. And they are never going to be won over, they're never going to be swayed, so that's not even the point of this video. I'm not going to try and argue with manual fans, GSR aficionados, people who just hate the GTA in general, because I'm wasting my own time. This video is for people who have an open mind, who like alternative thinking, and if nothing else, are just curious. How on earth an automatic Evo could turn out? Is this completely neutered, or is it some kind of forgotten genius car? Well, I would say it's actually the latter, and let's get into why. Now, for full exposure, this is my car, so this is one of those reviews which of course hits closer to home with me, but at the same time, the whole point of these reviews is to keep it factual and keep it as much as possible objective rather than subjective to my opinions. So let's talk some hard facts. First of all, what did Mitsubishi do with the GTA? Well, what they did was really clever. They didn't do, to reference another one of my recent reviews, what Dodge unfortunately did with the Ram SRT10. A brilliant idea. Big pickup truck with a Dodge Viper engine dropped into it sounds fantastic. It's rear-wheel drive, it's this big brute. And around a track it is quicker than a Renault Clio V6. But they dropped the 4-speed auto from a diesel truck into that car, into that truck, which just neuters so much of its potential, and that is one of the reasons why the manual version of that truck is so much more preferred by most drivers. Has that happened here? Well, thankfully no, because they didn't just drop any old transmission into it, they actually took the already good transmission setup of the Legnum VR4. Then they swapped out the gear ratios to suit this car better. That's already a good start. It showed that they're putting effort in. The second thing, the crucial thing that Mitsubishi did for the GTA, is actually giving it less power. Not just for the gearbox to cope with, but actually more importantly, it's how they gave it less power. It has that same, of course, 4G63 engine, 2 litre, straight 4, intercooler turbo, but the turbo setup itself is smaller on the GTA, so it puts out less power and less torque. But what that means, and the reason why they did that, is because the turbo setup is smaller, it spools up quicker. And what that actually means in practice is making up for the lag of a 2002 automatic gearbox. So is it as quick as the manual? Factually, no. But it is less powerful, it has less torque, so of course it's not going to be as quick. However, you might be surprised, it's not as much slower as you'd think. In fact, I did a 0 to 60 test, a GPS verified test yesterday myself, which is not on the channel yet, and I am planning to do so on the channel in a future video, wherein I just wanted to satiate my own curiosity about how quick this thing was. Now, I'd heard it bandied about that the GTA does 0 to 60 in about 6.2 seconds, which is really slow for an Evo, especially when the manual version is quoted at 4.7, a huge gulf between the two. So I was expecting, with the age of my car, the higher mileage, just wear and tear in general over time, that it might do maybe a 6.5, maybe even 7 seconds. So I ran it up to 60 miles an hour, and it did it in 5 seconds dead, which is a hell of a lot faster than I thought it was ever going to be. So there's your proof. Slower? Yes, but not much slower. For a car that has almost 30 pound-feet of torque less, 343 newton meters on this one, and about 10 or so horsepower less, to only be 0.3 of a second behind, and that was by no means a perfect launch, and I feel like I could definitely get it to go quicker, maybe a 4.9 or a 4.8. That's pretty damn impressive for an automatic Evo, given that once again they had never done this before. Now, there are other differences between this and the manual, which of course go beyond just straight line performance. Because the GTA is designed to be more accessible, it is also designed to be a little bit softer and a little bit more forgiving. So the suspension setup, the interior setup, they're all designed to have just that little bit of extra comfort. Although I will say, maybe it's just me comparing it to the cars that I've usually had, which are way more comfortable than an Evo, to say this is more comfortable than a GSR is kind of like saying sitting on one razor blade is more comfortable than sitting on two. Technically, you're not lying, but it's not exactly ideal. This is not a comfortable car by any stretch. But that gets into more of the daily life kind of stuff, so let's talk about that. For those who, like myself, were curious about owning one, What is this thing like to live with? We've talked about the performance, we've talked about the tech. What is it like in practice though? Well, actually, it's been a bit of a learning curve for me, more of an expectation curve, if you will, and this is something which I talked about in my announcement video when I first bought the car, because no other car that I've owned, and I mean no other car, has gone up and down so much in my esteem in even the first week of ownership at that point, because it was my expectations that were wrong. What I was expecting wasn't necessarily set in stone, but whatever it was that I was expecting isn't what the car is actually like. I've driven JDM cars before, Type Rs, Supras, etc., but still I was expecting something just a little bit different to what this is like. This car is raw, it is bare bones, and even though this is supposedly the comfort model, it doesn't feel that way to me. It feels much more like a rally car for the street that happens to have an automatic gearbox. So for some people that will put you off. For me, I think it's awesome that they even made this thing at all. So yes, it is harsh over bumps. My other car, for example, the Golf R32, compared to most of my older vehicles, the Golf feels like driving a little go-kart. When I go from driving the Evo to driving the Golf feels like a Bentley. It's so much more refined, so much smoother, so much more comfortable, so that should give you an idea of just how raw and focused and completely unflinching in its approach this Evo is. Now I'm guessing the GSR must be even more so in that regard, but I would have to say that if you're looking for that hardcore raw Evo experience, this thing certainly isn't lacking. Don't be fooled by me saying this is supposed to be softer. It really isn't. Like I mentioned earlier, it is more than capable enough to run rings around 90% of the cars you're going to come across on the street, auto or otherwise. I mean, 5 seconds dead, like I said, speaks for itself. You can roast most other cars on the road with that kind of acceleration, and as far as I know, mine is running close to stock, if not stock, engine components. That is one hell of a car with a 2002 gearbox. Now, the biggest downside to this car, well actually I would say there's two. One is more of a personal preference thing though, so we'll get to that in a second. By far the biggest downside to any Evo ownership is the fuel economy. And that kind of makes sense because it is a motorsport-derived vehicle, regardless of the gearbox of choice, and because the engine is so tightly wound, because it is this high-power, high-performance engine, of course it's going to be drinking fuel. It's only a 2-litre, but it still manages to empty that tank real fast. Now the tank in this thing is very small as well, which doesn't help. It's 48 litres, which, to reference the Golf as well, is a lot smaller. The Golf is like 12 point something UK gallons, this is about 10, so it really is a small fuel tank, and this thing will burn through that tank real quick. So if you are going to use one of these as a daily driver, you will be visiting the petrol station a lot, and I mean a lot. As someone who has daily driven a 200 mile an hour, 9 mile per gallon Bentley, even that didn't drink as much as this does, or at least it didn't seem like it. So in practice, I would say you should expect about 15-16 miles per gallon average. With that being said though, on the motorway, when I drove home in this car, I used half a tank from completely full to do 160 miles. So that's actually pretty damn good. That works out to what, about 32 miles per gallon, which is really strong for an Evo on the motorway, so that's why I said in practice you should expect it to be way lower than that. Even in semi-fast traffic, any kind of slowing down and speeding up and start-stop, it's going to drop like a stone. So that is by far the biggest downside. I think for most people, you don't even need to have measured expectations, because I think most people who want an Evo probably have experience of vehicles like this already. Maybe you've already had other JDM cars, maybe you've owned this kind of performance car, maybe you've come from a Subaru or something, maybe, you know, whatever, a Cosworth, an RS of some kind. So you'll already have a rough idea of what to expect. For me, that was just a little bit off, so the car was harsher, you know, hotter, more rattly, more tinny than I was expecting it even to be. But now that my expectations are realigned, not to what I was hoping for, but to what it actually is and what it actually offers, I'm actually finding that I love the car now. The only thing that I referenced earlier on, which is more of a personal dislike of mine, is actually to do with the gearbox. I love autos, of course, I bought this, so clearly I do. The thing I don't like so much about the gearbox though is, in practice, it sounds like a CVT. So it has that kind of unbroken sound of acceleration where when you pull away off the line, it sounds like you should be changing gear, but it is changing gear, you just can't hear it. So it has that kind of unbroken acceleration sound, which is just really weird to hear coming out of an Evo, especially when it's one like mine with a big bore pipe and a screamer downpipe. So it's super loud, but then you don't have that relief of a gear change noise, which takes some getting used to. If I could change one thing about this car, it would be to have a more modernised auto in it. For example, if it were possible for me to, let's say, drop the DSG from my Golf into this Evo, I think it would be pretty much perfect, because I think it would suit the car even more. For the time though, and again, Mitsubishi's first attempt at this, I'd say they did a pretty damn good job for performance alone, let alone anything else. Now, in terms of space, in terms of, practicality on more of a let's go shopping in it, or let's take a family around in it kind of level, it's great for that. The boot space is really good, the headroom is fantastic on this thing, despite the fact that it's not overly tall. Width room, even for a bigger driver, totally fine. Rear seat space is great, of course, being a saloon shape. And yeah, I mean, in terms of space, it's never lacking. It's not cramped at all. I love driving this thing. It just takes getting used to how much harder and more raw and hotter and the smells and all that you wouldn't usually have in a daily driver. Every time I drive this thing, it feels like I'm driving to a car show or taking it to Goodwood, to the Festival of Speed, maybe even to drive it up the hill. So if you're looking for that kind of experience, then boy does it deliver, automatic or otherwise. Ultimately, you can't fully compare this car to others which I've reviewed in a general sense, because it simply is so different to the kind of cars which I usually talk about. I tend to talk about, Jags, Astons, Bentleys, AMGs, these big, powerful luxury GT kind of things. This is a completely different ballgame. Even when you do compare it to the Japanese stuff which I've driven, this is nothing like a Supra. It's nothing like the Civic Type Rs. It is such a unique approach to driving that you've really got to want this. Or you can learn to want this, which I did in a very short time. And I will say, if you're looking to get, street cred or just the wow factor, boy does this car deliver, because I didn't originally want it in white, but it really has won me over, and in my first week of ownership, this car had more compliments, literally, than any other car I've ever had before. And any who follow the channel know that that's saying quite a lot, given the competition that this thing has. So ultimately, it's a car that is so specific that even for Evo fans, it's even more specific than that. You have to really want an automatic Evo to even entertain the idea of this. But I will say, as my final thought, the one thing, in fact, let's say two final thoughts. The one thing that is really good about this car, which no one can deny, even manual fans, technically especially manual fans, is that this is a genius vehicle to buy if you want an Evo for half the price. Because you can buy one of these, take the auto out, drop the manual box in, and you've got yourself essentially a slightly less powerful, but otherwise basically full Evo for half the price of what a full GSR would cost you. That's just genius. It's such an affordable way of getting a full-on Evo with the aforementioned performance for a fraction of the cost. The final thing though that I do need to mention is that the automatic gearbox does have more limitations on its tuning potential than the manual does. Manual Evos run, of course, huge amounts of power. The automatics are much more delicate when it comes to that. They do tend to be damaged more easily if you run them higher than, say, 400 horsepower. And it's mostly actually the torque which causes those issues rather than the power, so be careful. If you're looking for an Evo to turn into a drag monster, well, as I said, mine's already pretty damn quick, even with close to stock power or stock. So running 400, this thing would be a monster, but be careful. If you're going to be running that kind of power, either buy a manual or you will need to extensively modify the auto so that it can cope with that. But ultimately, that's it for my thoughts. Of course, my fellow Evo owners, put your thoughts and stories down below. I don't need to ask for the negatives because they will already be there on any kind of video like this for an automatic Evo. But if you did have one, if you still do, give us your stories, give us your warnings. Are there certain things that you should look out for? Because of course, Evos are known for needing regular servicing, which is absolutely true, that they can be expensive to run, which is also true. But let's be honest, that's pretty much the case for most high-performance cars, so they need to be treated well, and this is no exception. Ultimately, that's it for my thoughts on the Evo GTA. I am, for the moment, loving mine, and it is a refreshingly different approach to the cars that I would typically buy, but a pretty damn cool one in my opinion. Ultimately, that's it for this review though. Of course, stick around on the channel for more, and until next time I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.